Wonderful to meet you, sir. Thank you for taking a minute out today.
Oh, yes, I'm glad to be here today.
Me too. So, before we get into your good work, I want to know first and foremost, we're in the 5 year anniversary of this pandemic really taking hold. How
Mhm.
much of living through that time period, which there were so many unknowns, so many things changed, how much of living through that has influenced your work and what you do today?
Well, I think the biggest influence is working from home. I worked as a government contractor, so before that, we would travel at a Hanscom Air Force Base. It was 2 hours out of my day, 8 hours on the site. But when the pandemic hit, we were working from home, and interestingly enough, they gave me more time, and that's when I started to get into writing. Because I had that at that time to do research my family history and my book Old Grandmother's Tree, which is kind of tied into my family history. I think that was one of the biggest impacts for me personally was the work from home and the time that it gave me and the opportunities that it gave me.
So let's get to the heart and soul of what you did as a contractor and even now as a writer. I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of grade school kids, sixth graders. It's career day. And the kid in the back of the room is curious and is like, hey, what do you do for a living? How do you answer him?
Okay, what I do for a living is a government contractor for the U.S. Air Force. So I'm not an employee for the U.S. government, but I work for a company that has a contract with the Air Force. And I work as a project manager and I've worked on various different programs for the Air Force. And right now I'm working on a network solution for an Air Force base out McConnell Air Force Base, actually, and not too far, down in your direction.
Yeah.
And so that's what I do. So and it's interesting work as a contractor. You can pick and choose what projects you want to work on. You have that freedom. It's different from being a government employee. Now, as far as writing is what I do because I love it.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. You're getting into folklore and different things. Are you a fan of Joseph Campbell?
I know of Joseph
Okay.
Campbell, and I have. It's been a long time since I've read his books. But um, folklore is something that I loved as a child.
Yeah.
I would read the Norse folklores, the Greek and Roman folklore tales, um, ancient, Chinese folk tales, Japanese, any folk tales I found in the world. And so I always loved the stories because they're so ingenious. They're entertaining, but they also have lessons for life and about the human experience. And I think folklores are a universal language
Yeah.
for humanity as a whole. I mean, there's the values that they taught that are inside folk tales, the situations, the lessons learned. There's a universality to it, whether it's in the deep past or throughout the world. And so when I wrote the story about my Quebecois and my Algonquin ancestors, I used that folklore structure. So I created original folk tales. So if you read the stories, it's going to have a familiar feel to it, even though they're totally original, because it's written in that folklore style. So many people have written historical fiction about their ancestors. It's not uncommon.
Yeah.
Um, but what I did was I took their real story and real people who lived in the 17th century of Quebec and the early 20th century Quebec, and I put them inside a reimagined folklore magic Quebec with ancient trickster animal characters from Native American folklore. And so each story in the books, and there's 10 stories in the two volumes, they each have, kind of the lessons a little bit in there as well. They're very subtle. They're not like necessarily openly spoken, but you can definitely draw them up and pick that up there from there.
It's interesting, and I bring up Campbell because of the idea of mythology and folklore
Mm,
keeping us grounded in our historical march as people. Just all of the morals and the values and the stories and what we hold sacred. It's such a essential function, which is, I think, what's so fascinating about the way that you write. So I'm curious. Take me back to the very beginning, where you were born and raised. What were these foundational elements of you working for the government right now as a contractor, being in that world, and being a writer? How did these seeds get sown and evolve into you?
Well, I became a government contractor because I retired from the Army, did a 25-year career, started right out of high school, And then I went to West Point from the enlisted ranks of the Army. And then I served as an infantry officer, and then towards the end of my career, became a space operations officer. Served a year in Afghanistan, so I had a lot of experiences. I had a high level clearance, and so I was very much matched the profile of a person who would work transition from the military into government contracting work for the Air Force as a project manager. Um, Writing is something I think the roots of it kind of go back a different, many different ways. One is, I think, as far as the family connection portion, as a child, I was always very curious about our family's history in Quebec. Where do we come from? I knew, of my great grandparents. That was about as far back as I knew, but I wanted to know more. Um, and so later on, I was able to discover my roots, and I gave, through DNA tests to my mother and her siblings and researching family trees on Ancestry, I was actually able to discover some of the incredible, interesting stories about my ancestors. Um, and then I would say that, writing was something, the first time I actually started writing was after the death of my brother in 2013. He died of ALS. He was my younger brother. He was a year younger than me. And it was a very devastating illness. And if you know how ALS progresses at all, but it's a terrible thing to watch and to experience, be a part of it. And it stuck with me for a long time. And so I did a little writing on a blog called Augustine's Alley. And I wrote about science, I wrote about politics, I wrote about religion, history, just a lot of things. And I was really writing for myself. It was a way of kind of looking within myself and getting my own self-expression of my own values and where I was in life, especially after the loss of my brother. And then Old Grandmother's Tree started initially with just a simple little short story I wrote for my French class. I decided to take French because of Quebec ancestry. And I wrote this story where I took my great great grandparents in Quebec at their farm. And in the story, the farm animals sneak out of the barn at midnight, uh, grab a toboggan, and slide down the hill. Um, my great grandmother comes out of the house, finds them. At first, she wants to kind of chastise him for sneaking out at midnight. But at the end of the story, uh, she hops on the toboggan and slides down with the animals. And so that was the first story I wrote. And as I as I looked at that story, I said, this is kind of I enjoyed writing about it, and I wanted to write more about with these characters. And I discovered that my great grandmother, her ancestor was this Algonquin named Mitio Goku, and her story, she became the old grandmother's story, so of the book.
Yeah.
And so I wrote additional stories tying in the background with old grandmother as she, my ancestor Mitio Goku, her adventures and how that ties into my family history today.
So, who's been kind of a hero for you in your life? Who's been an inspirational force, a heroic force?
I think it's people in general. It's people who stand up, truth to power, who, as I look back on the history of people who had stood up for values in the face of opposition, and not necessarily in an aggressive way. I think, historically, St. Thomas More probably is one of my heroes
Yeah.
because he stood up to King Henry VIII. He didn't seek out a confrontation, but when painted into a corner, he stood by his values. And despite the opposition. So I think that is in a more deeper range, that's probably certainly one of my heroes. And certainly my father and my grandfathers. And I look back on their life. My father, but all three of them worked very hard to have to raise a family. Sometimes they took multiple jobs and, to raise it, to provide for us. And they're my heroes as well.
So, the one thing about writing about your life and your family is there's a level of legacy. You're locking a legacy in to pass it on to future generations. What was your vision when you were doing this? I know it comes from a literary background. You're putting a story out there, but was there a part of you that was like, I want to preserve this because it hadn't been preserved before? What was kind of your operating philosophy?
Well, I think it kind of starts, I think there's the idea of making connections and maintaining those connections with the past and trying to set a vehicle up to pass them on to my family today and to leave something as a legacy to our, my descendants and and other members of my family who are yet to come. Um, Michio Goku, the Algonquin woman of old grandmother's tree, she had such an inspirational story. She was a 22-year-old Algonquin woman in Trois-Rivières, Quebec, and she was married to another Algonquin. She had two small children. The Mohawks came up from New York in the south. They raided the settlement. Her husband was killed in the attack, and her two small children were kidnapped by the Mohawks, and she never saw them again. So here she is at 22 years old. She lost everything in her life. It was devastating. But yet, she didn't fall into despair. 5 years later, she married a French settler named Pierre Cauc, and she rebuilt her life and had another family. And her descendants are all throughout Canada and the United States. And when she died, the French priest at Trois-Rivières wrote of her that a very short but beautiful epitaph for her after she died. And it said that Michio Goku lived a full life with dignity, respect, and love, a loving and courageous Algonquin woman. And in those two sentences, there's so much in there to tell that talks about her as a person to live a full life. To me tells me she lived a life of connections, of among the people around her, a life of action and accomplishment. She lived a life of dignity. She maintained her self-respect. She was respected within the community, and being labeled a person of love and courage. She had the courage to start again after her tragedy, and yet she was also a person of love. There was no bitterness in her heart about her own experiences. And I think any of us would have been um, would be so happy to have that written about us. We could have, eulogies that are as long, 2 or 3 pages. But if someone could actually say that all those things about you, that you lived a life of dignity, respect, and love, and a full life, that's probably all that needed to be said. So I used her story, and I that was the genesis of the old grandmother's tree story. I retold the story of her marriage and her life with her children, a new life inside this magic folklore world with ancient, Native American trickster characters. And then I connected that to other stories of her descendants in Quebec.
So the one thing about digging into your family history is that you discover these things. For instance, I'm going to set this up this way. My dad passed in '08, and I remember we were going through all of his stuff, and I came across a couple like microtapes, and they just look like fodder, like nothing. And I'm a
Hmm.
tech guy, and I'm curious, so I was like, "What's on here?" He left his life story. About 4 or 5 years before
Wow.
that, he was spooked by somebody that had passed, so he
Mm.
decided to leave his life story, otherwise it wouldn't get etched. And at one point, he was talking about his great grandmother used to make him a yam. He was in Brooklyn, and he used to put sugar on it, and it was like his favorite thing. Loved it. And I had no idea. So after all this time, after he leaves this planet,
Mhm.
I find this out. So my question to you is, as you dig into your family history, what was something that you learned that you didn't expect, or what did you realize about yourself and the lineage of this family tree that you didn't expect?
Well, I think the first thing was after I gave my mother a DNA test was to find the Native American connection. It
Yeah.
showed up in the DNA. Growing up, we were always told my mother's family was 100% French. Well, it turns out the DNA test said, no, you're mostly French, but you also have a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of English, and also Native American. We didn't know that. Um, I did discover later, though, that my grandfather, my mother's father, who all this native ancestry comes through, he did know, but he didn't tell us. He
Wow.
withheld it. Now, why he did, I don't know. I do remember that I asked him one time about that, and he became very kind of upset about it and denied it. But I found out later from his first cousins that, oh, yeah, we knew about that. But I
Interesting.
didn't know after he died. And so that was probably the very first interesting discovery. The other thing was, as I researched my own tree. in Quebec. And I researched the French Canadian tree of other people that asked me, hey, I'd like to learn about my family. And I would do that for free and I would research their own tree. One thing I have found is that every single French Canadian person that I've built a tree for, there's always been at least one common ancestor with my tree.
Wow.
So every French Canadian, they're all related. They all have that. They're all part of that small founder population back in the 1600s, and we're all cousins. And so it really changed my perspective when you go to Quebec and you walk around, and I'm like, so this is the land that my ancestors walked on for hundreds of years, and in some case thousands of years. And all these people I'm looking at, they're actually my cousins. And so that was probably the most biggest the surprise and impact to myself. So it really makes me feel very much connected when I go north of the border.
So let me ask you this. If you had a dream tonight, ran into the 18-year-old version of you, figuring your life out, getting ready to get in there and do it, and you could give that young version of you a piece of advice based on this life you've led, the wisdom you've gained, what advice would you impart on that young version of you?
And the first thing I would say is you got to be patient. I think you got to be patient with the people around you. Um, I would say is that ask your grandparents and your great aunt and uncles why you have them, the stories that they have that they've kept within themselves. You know, as they're alive, they don't think about the importance of passing those stories on. They always think, oh, maybe next time. And sometimes when you're younger, you don't know what the right questions are to ask. So I think I would definitely would pass on to my 18-year-old self, especially when it came to the family, is make those strengthen those connections and collect that family history while you can.
So let's say you walk into a room full of everybody that knows you in your role as a government contractor. And they're all in there, and you swim through that room and go up to a podium, and you could tell that room something fun about you, a fact, a story, something that would humanize you, something they don't know. What would you tell that room?
Well, when I was an enlisted soldier, the one funny story I'll tell, a couple of them, but when I was an enlisted soldier, I was out on a little small guard post at night. We were doing a military exercise. I had a young sergeant next to me. He was only a couple of years older than me. I was 18, he was 20. And we saw movement in the woods, and we were out in North Carolina out of Fort Bragg. And we always were told that the locals will sometimes come out at night and try to steal your guns, your M16s. And so when we heard somebody moving towards us in the darkness, we were rather very nervous. And so we took our flashlights out and we were shining them in the light. Turns out these people came out of the darkness, and I think it was a commander of the battalion.
Yeah.
I couldn't identify what it was, but he just gave us a real butt chewing for having a flashlight out there.
Oh, wow.
And I remember being very upset about this, like, oh my gosh. So anyway, those guys left. And so I followed them at a distance. And then I kind of, as you're walking down the road back to, I guess, wherever they were going, I came up to the last guy in line. And I said to him, I said, so did you find the enemy? And he goes, and the guy said to me, yeah, they were right back over there. And so I said to him, I said, well, guess what? I'm that enemy. So I took my gun and I said, you're captured. So I captured this guy. I had no idea who he was. And so I brought him back to our battalion headquarters. And so I had no idea who he was. So I brought him back in. I came to the tent. The inside of the tent's lit up. But so I said to the battalion commander, I said, sir, I captured one of the enemy. And I pushed this guy into the tent. Turns out he was the battalion chaplain. They all broke out in laughter.
Oh,
And they all and so that's probably one of the funniest stories about when I enlisted. And probably the second story I would tell when I was a West Point cadet, Army Navy game. Because I was a prior enlisted, I was a little older than everybody else, and my classmates asked me if I would rent a vehicle for them to drive down to Philadelphia for the Army Navy game. So I took a taxi up to Newburgh, to north of West Point to get the vehicle. Turns out they didn't have any vans. Only thing they had was a small moving truck, like one of those panel trucks.
yeah.
And so it was a cargo truck with a door between the cabin to the back. And so I drove that down the mountain and said, "Oh my gosh, everybody's going to either love me or hate me." And so everybody was waiting on the steps of the barracks for me to come down, and they had heard that I couldn't find a van. And so they were all worried and upset because they wanted to get down and party down in Philadelphia for the Army Navy game. And so I pulled up with this van, and they all loved it. So they got like their blankets, their sleeping stuff, and pillows and stuff. They ordered pizzas. They had a big party in the back. So I'm driving down the highway with about 10 of my West Point classmates in the back of this panel van down to Philadelphia. It was kind of the crazy thing. And one of the guys took black engineering tape and put "Go Army, Beat Navy" in big letters on the side of this white panel truck.
That's awesome. You know, when you started saying that story, it reminded me of that scene from Smokey and the Bandit when they opened up the back of that 18 wheeler and there was a full casino in the back of it.
Yes, yes, very much. I think it's kind of like that. I think it's
Yeah,
definitely kind of like that.
that's awesome. So, of everything that you've done, accomplished, and evolved into in your life, what are you the proudest of?
Uh, that's an interesting question. I don't really think of it on my life like a one sense of who I am. I think there's a lot of things that I regret. That I wish I had done a little differently when I was younger. Um, I think as far as like accomplish, I think graduating from West Point is something that I'm very proud of. It's something that was very difficult to do in my life. It was 4 years. I had to struggle academically. I had to work very hard to kind of graduate with just kind of very mediocre grades, but it's still graduating from West Point is an accomplishment. And the other thing from accomplish that way would be graduating from the Army Rangers school. That was extremely difficult. In fact, I would put the 18 weeks I was in our Ranger school at the same level as 4 years at West Point, as far as the level of difficulty.
Yeah.
So those are things that I think I'm proud of in the sense. But I think if I had to pick one thing I want people to really remember me from like 10 years after I'm gone, I would say it's got to be the book.
Yeah.
It's got to be the book because that book it's a way of capturing our family history and our legacy and our stories. And that's the one thing that I want to be remembered by, that I want to leave as a piece of myself going forward. Because I don't think most people are going to care that I graduated from West Point. People aren't going to care that I did an Army Ranger, but they might really remember this book and then the connections and the stories that it gave them that are part of their own history. And so that's what I want to be remembered for. And I think I'm very much in that thinking. I'm very much affected by the loss of two of my brothers. I have two. I have one younger sister and three younger brothers. And I told you I lost one brother from ALS in 2013, and then about a little bit more a year ago, Christmas Eve of 2023, I lost my youngest brother to alcoholism, and he was like 7 years younger than me. And I look, their lives kind of disappear, and I really had a sense that going inspired that I wanted to leave something of myself. If something happened to me, I wanted to have something that represents who I am and the aspirations that I have. And I think that book for me represents that.
So at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you, Joseph. Family, friends, everyone that reads your book, everyone that you work with, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
How do other people see me?
Yeah, because everybody
I,
has
I,
sees you in a certain light.
I think, I think people, and my wife kind of described me this one time as kind of a force of nature. And, you know, I'm a person that likes to make things happen and make connections. And in some ways, I think I'm a polarizing person because I think there are many people in my life I look at really, really like me and love me and like have a strong connection with me. And there's other people that for some reason I don't make connections with that just don't get me and just don't want to have anything to do with me. And so I think I'm very polarizing, but I think I would say is I'm a force of nature that I try to make connections and I try to make things happen.
I think about it in like David Letterman. You either love him or you're intimidated or you don't. You know,
Right,
it's
right.
it's that whole thing. So if anyone wants to pick up a copy of Old Grandmother's Tree or reach out to you, learn more, any of the good business, where do they go?
Well, you can go to the website oldgrandmotherstree.com. This is written as one word, no apostrophe in there, oldgrandmotherstree.com. And on the website, you'll find a Wikipedia of all the characters. You'll have background illustration information of myself, the artist of the book. You'll have some sample illustrations and summations of the book. Also, there'll be a link there for you to order the book from Amazon. And the books are available in English and also French.
Excellent. This has been wonderful, Joseph. Thank you. Thank you for your story. Thank you for your time. As you probably already know with what I'm doing here, I love capturing the stories. So
Mhm.
I think more families getting out there and capturing the essence of who they are, I think it hits so many levels of who we are as human beings in this very short time on this planet to encapsulate and pass it
Mhm.
on to successive generations.
Sure, absolutely. It's very important to make those connections.
Yeah, certainly is. Joseph, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Best of
Thank
luck.
you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, friends. Joe Dimino here. I just wanted to let you know that after 30 years or so, I have finally released my first book of poetry through the mighty Spartan Press here in Kansas City, Missouri. As the creator and host of both Neon Jazz Radio and the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino podcast, along with being a visual artist, I'm ready to embark on a new adventure and want you to be a part of it. You can get a copy online via Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and actually on the streets in Kansas City at the great Prospero's bookstore off 39th Street. You can also visit joedimino.com for links to the book, to more poetry, and everything in my world, including paintings. Thanks for all of the love and support over the years, and please dig the words.